In this video, we're going to create an interface, also known as a graphical user interface, or GUI for short. Since the GUI is what your user will interact with, it's important to make good decisions about where you place the various controls that will comprise your forms. And so what we're going to do is introduce several of the most popular GUI controls from the toolbox, but we're also going to introduce some best practices, actually 7 best practices that will give us some general guidelines on developing a Windows Forms application. Now, while we're only going to talk about 7 best practices, there are probably hundreds if not thousands of tips, ideas, and rules for designing effective user interfaces. And there are entire volumes of books written on nothing but this topic alone, so I hope only to introduce some of the most fundamental ideas in this video. So let's begin by creating a new project. Last time I showed you how to use File, New, Project in order to bring up the New Project dialog box. There's another way to do it. When you look in VisualStudio.net at the Start page, there's also a button near the lower left-hand side, New Project, that will accomplish exactly the same thing. So we want to select Visual C Projects, Windows Application, and then we're going to change this to Lesson 04, and we shouldn't have to change the location if you've been following along in the previous video. Once we've made these selections, then we're going to click OK. And in just a moment, a new Windows application will be created, and the default form designer will appear in our design surface, in the main area of our VisualStudio.net IDE. And what we see is a design surface. And what we'll do with this design surface, as you saw from the previous video, is that we're going to draw and lay out the location of controls on our form that will actually be used by our end user. There's many different types of designers in VisualStudio.net. This particular one lets us create Windows Forms visually, but what happens behind the scenes, as we'll take a look at near the end of the video, is that it creates code for us automatically. We don't need to touch that code, but we could if we needed to, in order to dynamically move the controls around on our form on an ad hoc basis. So what we're going to do right now is create a fictitious customer contact form for our company. It's going to allow our customer service team to gather information about those people who contact us about our services. So the first thing I'm going to do is take some label controls and put them on my form. And to do that, I'm going to go to my toolbox and click on it, and you notice that it jettisons out from the left to the right, and now we can select the control that we want to use, and we can drag it and drop it onto our designer surface where we want it to go. Or there's another way to do this. Let's go ahead and just hover over the toolbox and double click the label. And when we do that and let it retract, you'll notice that there is a second label. It's actually covering the first label. We'll move it a little bit so you can see them both. Okay? We'll move these around. It's also important to notice that the toolbox has lots of different components. We've only looked at the Windows Forms little tab here, but there's actually tabs for data controls, for components that allow us to work with Windows and with the file system. This tab, the data one, will let us take a look at and interact with databases, SQL Server, Oracle, and any other type of database or data source we might have. Of course, we've already looked at a few controls from the Windows Forms Toolbox tab, and we're going to look at a few more in this video. There's also a clipboard ring and another ring that just has nothing in it seemingly. And some of these tabs, the clipboard ring and the general ring, we look at in other videos on LearnVisualStudio.net. We're not going to cover them, however, in this particular series of videos. Let's get back to the Windows Forms tab of the toolbox. And now we'll let it retract back so that we can work with the controls that we already have on our form. What we want to do is change some information about our labels, and we do that by using this little window over here on the right-hand side called the Properties window. A property is an attribute of a control that either changes its appearance or changes its behavior. And we saw that we could use this in the previous video in order to change the text that's displayed to the user, and change other properties such as the name of the control. Now what we did when we changed the name of the control is actually changed the way that the control is referred to in the code view. So we might in this case use LBL first name, but notice when we change that, it does not change the appearance of the label to the end user. We have to change the text property in order to make that appear correctly the way we want it to. First name. Okay. And also another thing that we want to notice is that when we did name this, we mimicked the value that we were eventually going to type into the control, first name. And we prefixed that with a little three-letter designation, LBL, which stands for label. This is a great way for us to remember the purpose of a given control whenever we're looking at it in code view. This would also differentiate it from, say, a text box that allows somebody to type in their first name, so you could have TXT first name, for example. Another thing to notice is that we have two different labels, and these are two different instances of the label control. By changing the properties of one of our controls, we're not affecting the properties of the other control. So let's go ahead and change that now. We'll change, first of all, the viewable text to gender, and then we'll also name our control. And what do you think we'll name it? LBL for label, and then I typically use the exact same text that was available in the label itself, in this case gender. And so that brings us to our first best practice, and that is that you should align label text to the left and use a colon after the text. By default, text is moved to the left-hand side, and you can change that with the text align property. And notice that when we select this, a little mini designer surface pops up, and whenever I make a selection over here, like this top right, notice what happened to our gender control. The word gender appeared in the top right hand corner of our label control. Or if I select in the middle, notice that it kind of spaces itself right in the middle of the control, and so on. So the property box is filled with neat little tools like this to help us remove the ambiguity of what we would expect to see once we make that selection. And that's true of several different properties here in the property box. For example, we can change the font by selecting the little ellipsis here. Or we can change the font by going to the name and using the drop-down list box, and it gives us a little preview over on the left-hand side of what the font will look like. So there are several different ways of selecting the font that we want to use for our label. And then also there is something called the for color property, which allows us to choose the color of our text, and we get these three little tabs here, so we could change that and make our text red, or we can select a web-friendly color or one of the system colors. So again, these neat little visual tools help us to remove the ambiguity and help us to know exactly what to expect whenever we make a selection. In this case, we're going to go back and select control text, which is the default. And before we move on, there's a second best practice that I'd like to highlight, and that is that you should choose names for your controls that describe their purpose. And this really goes back to what we were saying before with the LBL prefix, and this helps us to indicate the type of control that this is. In other words, an LBL would indicate that it's a label control. BTN would indicate that it's a button control. TXT would indicate that it's a text box, and so on. So right now let's add a couple more labels to our form, and then we'll just move them here into place. And let's change this one to interested in. And so we'll name this LBL interested in. Now, I want to make another point as well. Why have this best practice? Why you should choose names for your controls instead of just letting them default to their original names. Like in this case, the original name is label 2. Well, because you never know whenever you're going to need to make a change to that label on a dynamic basis. And it's just overall a good practice so that when somebody comes in to support your code, they can look at this control and know that it's a label instead of having to guess that it's another type of control that just has taken on the appearance of a label. And it just removes ambiguity. So you should always use these naming conventions and never falter from that. Might be easier to sometimes avoid doing it the right way, but that will lead to problems that are unexpected in the future. So let's continue on. The next control that I'm going to highlight is the text box control. Again, we saw this in the previous video, but let's go ahead and talk a little bit about it now. The text box control allows a user to input or type information into the form. So as always, the first thing that we're going to do is change its name. So let's go down here to the name property, and again we're going to use our 3-letter prefix txt and then call it first name. And this is another convention that I use. I typically, whenever I'm creating input forms like the one you see here, I try to name the text box the same as the label, or the control the same as the label, so you can see that the two match up together or have a purpose of working together. And the label is simply a visual cue, and the box itself is going to be where the information is input. So it's good to keep them kind of grouped together by naming them the same thing and just changing their prefixes. I'll just highlight a couple of other properties about the text box. The first one is the text align, which will remind you of the text align property that we saw before with the label. And again, you can select whether it should be to the right or should it be centered and so on. We're just going to default it back to the left. And you can also change the back color as well. Let's go ahead and move up to back color. And currently, by default, window is selected, but we could go over here to custom colors and select this neat little peach color, and give our application a little bit of style. But I want to caution you before now, and let's go ahead and bring in another best practice, and that is this: that you should always use the default colors and the default fonts for your applications. Sure, it might seem like a pretty cool idea to change everything up and make your text boxes different colors to indicate different types of things and so on. But you should try to avoid this because it winds up doing two things. First of all, it annoys the end user, and it also makes your applications look amateurish. You should always strive to have your applications be as or the conform to the Windows standards, and that is to always use the default colors, the default fonts. The default color for your applications is sometimes referred to as Battleship Gray, although in this case it's more of a tannish type of color. But don't play around too much with the colors unless you have an absolutely positively great reason why you're doing that. So let's go ahead and select the default again, which was window. And now let's change the text. We don't want our users to see the word textbox1 when they open up our application, so I'm just going to delete that from the properties window and hit the enter key on my keyboard, and that clears out the value by default that will appear in the form when the application is run. Next, let's add some radio buttons to our design surface, and I'm just going to double click the radio button icon twice on the toolbox and position them here in place. And radio buttons allow users to select one option from a number of preset options that you have available. And this is really good whenever you have 4 or fewer. If you have more, then you should probably use a list or a combo box, like we'll talk about in a minute, to display those options. On this case, we just have male and female. So what we'll do is change, first of all, the text to the first one to male, and then change the text of the second one to female, just so we can get them resized down, so we can kind of fit them on the same line here. And then let's go ahead and name these, and I'm going to use the 3-letter extension RAD for radio button, and then male for the text that we typed in. And the same would be true here, RAD female. And suppose that we want the male option to be selected by default because most of our customers are male. Okay, what we can do is change the checked property from false to true. Now, by default, when our application opens up, male will be selected, and our customer service representative can select female, and so the little black dot will remove itself from male and go to female. The next control that we want to highlight is the list box. And the list box is great whenever you need to allow users to select one or more items from a list, whenever you have more than 4 options. And also whenever you want to allow potentially more than one item to be selected at a time by the user holding down the Control or their Shift key while selecting items in the list box. Now, what we'll name this, first of all, is LST, our 3-letter prefix, and then we'll call it interested in. And then we'll want to add items to this list box. Now, in future videos, we're going to show how you can dynamically enter items in a list box, maybe from an XML file or from a database or programmatically. But here we're just going to manually enter them using the Properties dialog. Let's go to Items, and you'll notice there's this word collection here, and I'm going to select it, and a little button with an ellipsis, 3 little dots, appears, and I click on that, and it brings up the string collection editor. And what you can do is put an option on each line. So first of all, we'll just type widget and then hit the enter key on our keyboard, and then type in some more: gadget, foo, bars, buckles, and hammers. And these are the items that we have for sale within our organization. Now recall that one of the values of the list box is that it can allow selection of more than one item. And in order to change that behavior, we can select the selection mode. In this case, by default, it's set to 1, but we can select multi-simple and allow people to select more than one. So if the customer calls in and says, hey, I want foo and bars, then your customer service representative can make both of those selections. The next control that we'll highlight is the combo box. And the combo box is sort of like a cross between the text box and the list box. It allows users to select one item from a list, or optionally, the user can type in their own text. So in our case, we might have the 10 most popular cities or towns where we sell our products, but it allows a customer service representative to also type in another city, maybe 50 miles out or across the world. And so the first thing we're going to do is name it. And the prefix we'll use is CBO for combo, and then city. The next thing we want to do is add items to our combo box. And so again, we'll go to our items collection, click on our little ellipsis, and use the string collection editor again, this time to add cities. So in my case, in our town, it would be surrounding areas: Dallas, Mesquite, Garland, Richardson, and Rowlett. And then also what we want to do is, because it's like a text box, change its text property and just remove it completely. And we can modify the behavior of this control by changing its drop-down style. By default, drop-down is selected, but we can also have drop-down list or simple. If we select drop-down list, this will limit selections to only those items in the list. And simple will allow us to just type in or select from the drop-down list. The next control that we're going to introduce is the checkbox. And the checkbox allows an option of yes or no, or true or false. And it can be used in a group sort of fashion if you want to limit the options to 4 or fewer number. Otherwise, you should probably use the list or the combo box in that case. But in this case, we're going to change this text to saw our ad. So this will allow somebody to, our customer service representative, to say, how did you learn about us? And they say, oh, we saw your ad, so they can check that. And we'll name this CHK, our 3-letter extension, and saw our ad. And we can default this to checked if we wish by selecting the checked property. And then finally what we're going to do is add some buttons onto our designer surface, and this will be very familiar to you if you watched a previous video in lesson 2. And the button control is used whenever you want to allow the user to indicate that they are ready to take action on your form, whether that action is, okay, save my information, or validate the information, or just cancel this, I'm not prepared to do anything at this time. So what we'll do is change our text for the first one to OK and the name to BTN, our 3-letter prefix. OK. And then the same would be true for BTN cancel. And let's scroll up here to cancel. So our form is pretty much finished right now. We need to even some things out and move some things around in order to make it look aesthetically pleasing. Now let's talk about the reason why we have so many different controls. We could have just used text boxes for the entire input of this form. For example, somebody could have typed in male or female. They didn't need a radio button. And the same thing would be true for city. You know, they could just type in their city name. But whenever you go to report on the data, and whenever you're working with computers, consistency is very necessary. You could have somebody mistyping or misspelling certain words like male or female. And so you may have 10 different versions of this maybe saved into your database, and that would be a real problem from a reporting perspective. There's an old term in programming called garbage in, garbage out, and so if you were to allow this type of data entry, then you're going to have bad reporting and potentially some errors in the logic of your code if you're expecting your user to type something in correctly 100% of the time. It just doesn't happen. So this leads us to another best practice, and that is this. Use the correct control for the kind of interactivity and data that you wish to gather. So in other words, the way that you use a list box is different than the way that you would use radio buttons, and that's still different from the way that you'd use a combo box. They each have a purpose, and it's important that you understand what that purpose is and seek to use the correct kind of control in the correct setting. And so that puts the burden on the developer to know when it's appropriate to use certain kinds of controls when designing a user interface. So that's one challenge that you'll have as you begin to develop your applications. Now let's move on to another best practice that I kind of glossed over, but is very important, and that is that you should align the OK and Cancel buttons near the lower right-hand corner of your form. If you look at any of the Microsoft Office products, they follow the Microsoft standard, and that is first you have the OK button, and then second you have the Cancel button when reading from left to right. Now there might be other types of forms that you design in the future that you're going to need multiple buttons. And so it might be okay to align those buttons down the right hand side, or you have a number of different buttons, or maybe you want to insert an apply button, which is another standard of where to put that. It goes in between the OK and cancel button. So you have some options as far as that's concerned. But generally, if you're only going to have an OK and cancel button, those should be aligned in the lower right hand corner. And the next best practice is that you need to keep your controls and your labels aligned in imaginary columns, which is generally what I've done here, although we could use some tweaking in order to move things over and kind of space things out correctly. Maybe I'll make this bigger so that it covers both the male and female radio buttons, and in turn we'll have to move this over, and we'll move this so that it aligns nicely and looks aesthetically pleasing. Additionally, over here in our left column, we'll need to align these as well. So what you'll want to do is in the left hand side have the labels, and the right hand side have the input controls. Now, it might not surprise you that the form itself has many properties. For example, we can change this to our customer service application. So we change the text property of the form, and notice what happens when I hit the enter button. Across the top of the form, customer service application appears. We can also change neat settings like the start position, if I can find it here. Let's see, it's here somewhere. Start position, there we go. And we can have it start in the center of the screen whenever the application starts, which is what we want. And there's also another setting that we'll want to change, and that is the form border style. Whenever we run our application, we can resize the form. However, we haven't added anything that allows the controls to resize themselves. So when I pull this out to the right, ideally what would happen are some of these controls, like the text boxes, the list controls, the combo boxes, they would all increase in size as well. But we haven't written any of that code, so it would look kind of dumb whenever you pull this out and there's just a bunch of gray area. So what we should do is disable that by changing this from sizable to fixed single. And we'll save. And as we look at our application, there's a couple of settings that we'll want to make. Your application should be able to respond only the keyboard. So that brings us to another best practice, and that is that you should be able to use tab indexes in order to allow keyboard-only navigation on your form. And the way that you accomplish this is by using the tab index property on every control. So let's go ahead and find that. Notice here that we have a tab index. Currently it's set to 4, but we'll want to change that to 1 for the first control, 2 for male, 3 for female. And so we go from top to bottom, left to right, and start assigning tab indexes to each of these controls. So now let's save this and click our Start button in order to test out our application so far. And notice that, at least on my screen, it doesn't really reflect that way in the viewable recording area, but it has appeared right in the middle of my screen. And notice that I can just use the tab button on my keyboard to tab through from male to female. But what happened? Why didn't it go to female? Well, the reason is because it treated these items as a group, and it will only go to one item at a time in that group. Now, what happens if we have multiple sets of radio buttons, and we want them all the two sets to operate independent of each other, so that when I select female, I can also select maybe a different option, saw or add yes or no. What you do in that case is use a different control called a group box, and we're not going to cover that right now, but that's what you would use in that situation. So let's continue on tabbing through to the interested in, to city, to saw our ad, to OK, and to cancel. Let's make a couple more observations here. Notice that we've allowed multi-select inside of our list control, and we also allowed typing and or selection in the city. And so some of the functionality is just automatic. We don't have to write any code in order to achieve some of these effects within our Windows applications. Let's go ahead and close this, and we click the little red X in the upper right hand corner of our application. Now I want to talk about one last thing before we conclude this video, and that is something we alluded to earlier, and that would be that the designer really is a code generator for us. If we take a look over here in our Solution Explorer and we look in the code view by just double clicking anywhere, notice that we have this little section that says Windows Form Designer Generated Code. This is called a region, and it hides the details. Notice how it goes from line 59 to line 212. It's because we've hidden the lines in between, rolled them up in order to make this aesthetically more pleasing to us as we begin to code our applications. But if I click the little plus sign next to this line, it opens up a bunch of code that was generated by the designer surface by dragging and dropping items onto our design surface and then setting the properties in the property box off to the right hand side. And so you can see here that each of these, like labels and, for example, the text box, TXT first name, we change the back color, the location, the name, the size, the tab index, and what the text is. And all these are set in code. Now, if we didn't have a neat designer like the one that VisualStudio.net gives us, then we'd have to type all this in by hand. So you can see that VisualStudio.net is a real time saver for kind of preventing us from having to deal with the real nitty-gritty details of form layout. It actually makes the whole process pretty fun. But this is a general truism that your form designers, no matter what kind of designers they are, and we did note that there are several different ones, and we're just looking at one designer, which is the Windows Form Designer, that your designers generate code, for the most part, behind the scenes for you so that you don't have to write this all yourself. Now, you have the opportunity to change this. For example, if I wanted to change first name and default it to Bob, I can save this and then let's run our application, and notice what happens as soon as our application opens up. The first name defaults to Bob. So we do have the opportunity to change these values if we want to, either dynamically in code or just by going then back into our property designer and changing this back to nothing. So we've talked a lot about what you can actually do with VisualStudio.net. We haven't talked about the C# language yet, and that's coming really soon, so hang in there. But I want to show you some of the neat things you can do and write applications very quickly once you learn just some very basic C# language constructs, and we'll talk about that again in just a moment. So be sure to get some practice by completing the exercise in this lesson before you continue on, though.